Sarah Walker never imagined her life would change with one cruel sentence. "You will marry Ethan Blackwood by next week or we all lose everything." The words echoed in her mind as she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, fingers gripping the quilt she had sewn herself. Outside the window, the Texas sunset spread across the sky in golden pinks, but inside her chest, her heart pounded with fear and disbelief. She was 22. She had never been kissed, never been on a real date. Her life revolved around the family farm, her sketchbook, her quiet dreams of one day seeing the world beyond their dusty town. She was the good girl, the dependable one, the daughter who didn't cause trouble, and now her parents were asking her to give up everything she was, to step into a world she had only seen in magazines and news headlines. Her older sister Olivia was everything she was not: stunning, famous, admired, a supermodel on every major runway, the one who had captured the heart of Ethan Blackwood, a billionaire tech mogul whose name was whispered with awe. Everyone in the Walker family had celebrated the engagement like it was a royal announcement. Olivia marrying Ethan was their family's golden ticket, out of debt, out of drought, out of irrelevance. But then came the accident, a twisted heap of metal found on a rainy night outside Austin. Brake failure, they said. Ethan had survived, but barely. He had been in a coma ever since. No signs of waking, just machines keeping him alive in a hospital suite that cost more per day than Sarah's family earned in a month. Now the Blackwoods were threatening to cancel the wedding entirely, and with it, the multi-million-dollar investment that would have saved the family farm. Sarah's father slammed the kitchen table so hard the salt shaker fell and rolled across the floor. "The Blackwoods are pulling their investment. Without this marriage, we're done." Her mother's voice was brittle and cold. "Olivia won't do it. She said she won't ruin her career for a man who might never open his eyes again. But you can do this, Sarah. You owe us." And with that, every part of Sarah's quiet world began to collapse. That night, alone in her room, Sarah sat in silence, the air around her still and heavy. She stared into the cracked mirror above her dresser, touching her lips, as if trying to imagine what it meant to kiss a stranger, not out of love or passion, but because it was demanded of her. Her chest ached not from heartbreak, but from the weight of duty, of sacrifice, of becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone who was about to marry a man who had never even looked at her. She whispered into the quiet darkness, "Ethan Blackwood, I don't know you, and you don't know me, but I guess we're about to be husband and wife." Outside, the wind carried the scent of dry hay and fading summer. Inside, Sarah sat with her hands folded in her lap, her whole body trembling under the weight of what was coming. The next day, cameras flashed outside the private hospital. Reporters buzzed with confusion and curiosity. "Who's the girl stepping in for Olivia Walker?" they asked. "Why would a billionaire's family allow this wedding to go on?" Inside, Sarah stood in a plain white dress, her hands clutching a small bouquet, her face pale but composed. Beside her, machines beeped steadily. Ethan Blackwood lay unmoving on the hospital bed, his dark lashes resting against his cheek, his face beautiful but unreachable, like a statue carved from silence. The officiant's voice rang out over the sterile room. "Do you, Sarah Walker, take Ethan Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Sarah's mouth went dry, her voice barely a whisper. "I do." And with the scratch of a pen on a legal document, she became Mrs. Ethan Blackwood, a virgin bride to a billionaire in a coma, while outside, the world whispered and watched. The Blackwood estate stood like a monument to American wealth, nestled high above the Colorado Rockies, where the air was sharp and clean. The mountains cast long shadows over the sprawling grounds, and the mansion itself rose in layers of stone and glass. Modern, yet timeless, surrounded by manicured gardens, fountains, and the quiet judgment of those who served inside it. When Sarah arrived at the estate as Mrs. Ethan Blackwood, she stepped out of the sleek black car with trembling fingers, her suitcase in hand, her heart pounding like it might break through her chest. She had never been outside Texas before, never stayed anywhere fancier than a motel on the outskirts of town during the state fair. Now, she was walking through marble halls with Persian rugs and chandeliers as large as pickup trucks, every footstep echoing like she didn't belong. The staff had lined up politely, but their eyes said everything. They looked at her plain dress, her scuffed shoes, the soft way she spoke when she greeted them and smiled, and behind their trained expressions was quiet confusion, judgment, suspicion. She could hear it in the way they whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. "She's the sister, not the fiancé," one maid murmured. "She's never even met him," another said. "Just a farm girl," a third one added, and Sarah felt the sting of each word, though she kept her chin lifted and her voice steady. In the grand hallway leading to Ethan's room, Margaret Blackwood stood waiting, Ethan's mother, elegant and sharp in a black pantsuit and pearl earrings. She didn't smile when she saw Sarah. Instead, her eyes scanned her from head to toe, cool and precise. "You're smaller than Olivia," she said without emotion, "and much quieter. Let's hope you're less trouble." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Margaret turned and walked away, leaving behind a chill that not even the heated floors could melt. Ethan's room was large, bright, filled with medical equipment and fresh flowers delivered daily. The windows opened to a mountain view that looked like a painting. Sarah stood by the door, unsure whether to enter. The nurse nodded encouragingly and said, "He won't bite." Her attempt at humor fell flat as Sarah stepped inside, her eyes settling on the man in the bed, Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire she had just promised to love and care for. He looked nothing like the magazine photos Olivia had framed in her old bedroom back home. In those he was smiling at galas, standing tall beside celebrities, dressed in crisp suits with that confident look rich men always seem to wear. But here he was, silent and still, tubes running to his arm, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm controlled by machines. He was handsome, yes, with a strong jaw, high cheekbones, dark hair falling messily over his forehead. But there was a fragility to him now that made Sarah's breath catch. She sat beside him, fingers clasped tightly in her lap, unsure what to say, unsure what kind of wife she was supposed to be to a man who couldn't hear her. Finally she spoke softly. "I guess this is where our story begins." The words felt strange, but they settled into the quiet like seeds waiting for something to grow. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah settled into a rhythm. She woke early, checked on Ethan, ate breakfast alone at the long dining table where no one really spoke to her unless required. She walked the gardens, sketched in her notebook, and returned every afternoon to sit by Ethan's side, reading aloud from his favorite books which she had learned about from the nurse who had cared for him the longest. He liked biographies, the woman said, and poetry, the kind most men pretend to hate but secretly read. Sarah smiled at that, and picked up a volume of Robert Frost. Each day she read with gentle patience, sometimes pausing to talk to him about her life, the farm, her mother's cooking, the way the Texas sun burned her skin in summer. Sometimes she just sat in silence, letting her presence fill the room, not expecting anything in return, and slowly the whispers among the staff began to shift. "She's different," someone said in the kitchen. "She actually cares," another added. "Maybe this isn't about money after all." And Sarah heard none of it, but somehow felt the change in the air. One evening, as she brushed a lock of hair from Ethan's forehead, her fingers accidentally brushed his, warm and still. Her chest tightened, and she whispered, barely audible, "I don't know if you'll ever wake up, but if you do, I hope you'll remember that I tried." The words hung in the air long after she left the room, like a promise, like the first note of a song yet to be written. The days passed in quiet repetition, and with each sunrise, Sarah's world inside the Blackwood estate grew more complex, though the halls were silent and the staff discreet. She could feel the weight of unspoken judgment following her like a shadow. Her presence in Ethan's life remained a mystery to many and a threat to some. especially to those who had once believed Olivia would be the one standing at his side. Yet Sarah never tried to explain herself. She simply stayed, quietly, consistently, with a sense of duty that softened into something else. Each morning she brought fresh wildflowers into Ethan's room, choosing colors that reminded her of the Texas fields, hoping some small part of him might respond to their brightness. She adjusted his blankets, spoke to his nurses, learned the names of his medications, and read to him with a voice so steady it almost disguised the fear in her heart, the fear that maybe he would never wake up, never know who she was, never hear the things she whispered when no one else was there, and yet she stayed, not out of obligation anymore, but because somewhere along the way, the silence between them had started to feel like a language of its own. One afternoon, Sarah sat by the window sketching the mountains as golden light spilled across the sky. Her pencil moved across the page in slow strokes as she glanced up at Ethan, then down again. Every drawing started to resemble him, not just his face, but the quiet strength of someone who bore the weight of a world he could no longer touch. As she looked at the curve of his brow, the lines of his jaw, she realized how deeply she had memorized him, how familiar he had become despite the silence. She reached for his hand without thinking, holding it gently in hers, and whispered, "You don't know me yet, but somehow I feel like I know you." That evening, something shifted. A small flicker, a twitch of his fingers beneath hers, so slight she thought she had imagined it. She leaned forward, heart pounding, watching his hand, holding her breath, but nothing followed. The silence returned, and she told herself it was only hope playing tricks on her. Still, she stayed later than usual that night, her hand resting over his, unwilling to let go just yet. Meanwhile, in a penthouse across the city, Olivia Walker tossed her phone onto a marble countertop, her jaw clenched as she read the latest tabloid headline, "Mystery Wife Moves In with Comatose Billionaire." She had thought this problem would fade with time, had thought that by stepping away, she could preserve her public image and quietly wait for Ethan's condition to worsen. But now, with whispers of his condition improving and her younger sister playing the role she had abandoned, Olivia felt something she rarely acknowledged: fear, and not just fear of losing her place in society, but fear that Ethan, if he woke, might actually care for Sarah, might even believe she belonged. Back at the estate, the staff had begun to warm to Sarah. A housekeeper named Mrs. Camden often lingered after delivering meals, offering kind words and stories about Ethan's childhood. "He never liked being fussed over," she said one morning as Sarah adjusted the curtains. "But he always noticed when someone tried." Sarah smiled softly, wondering if Ethan would ever realize how much she tried now, not just for him, but for herself, for the girl she used to be before duty became identity. Then came the night when everything began to change. Sarah was reading aloud from a collection of Frost poems, her voice calm and steady, when Ethan's hand moved again, this time more noticeably. Her breath caught as she reached for the nurse's call button, her fingers trembling. Within minutes, the room was filled with doctors, nurses, blinking monitors, and whispered orders. Sarah stood in the corner, hands pressed together as they examined him, called his name, watched his eyelids flutter with the weight of something returning. Finally, the lead physician turned to her and said, "His neurological responses are improving. He's coming back." The days that followed were a blur of cautious hope. Ethan remained unconscious, but his reactions grew stronger. His fingers curled when touched, his eyes moved beneath closed lids. His heart rate changed when Sarah entered the room, as if some part of him recognized her. And with each moment, her feelings deepened. They had no conversations, no shared memories, yet she felt closer to him than anyone she had ever known, and that closeness, that quiet intimacy, became something she could no longer deny. One morning, as she was helping the nurse adjust his pillows, Ethan's eyelids opened briefly, unfocused and confused, but undeniably awake. Sarah gasped, stepping closer, calling his name softly, but he only stared blankly before his eyes closed again. Still, it was real, and for the first time, hope was no longer a whisper but a promise. The news traveled quickly, and it didn't take long before Olivia arrived unannounced, dressed in a designer coat, her heels clicking across the marble floor. Her entrance as dramatic as her exit had once been. She found Sarah sitting quietly in the sunroom with a sketchpad in her lap, and without pretense or kindness, Olivia sat across from her and said, "He's waking up, and when he does, he'll remember me, not you." Her voice was calm, rehearsed, weaponized. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She closed her sketchpad, met Olivia's gaze, and spoke without flinching. "You left him. When he needed someone the most, I didn't." Olivia scoffed. "You think that matters? You think this little performance of yours makes you worthy?" Sarah's voice didn't rise, but it steadied. "I didn't do this to be worthy. I did it because it was right." Later that evening, Sarah returned to Ethan's room, his breathing steady, his face peaceful, and sat beside him as she had done every night. She held his hand, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, and whispered, "I know she'll try to rewrite the story, but I'll be here when you're ready to remember the truth." Her words were not a challenge, but a quiet vow. Ethan stirred again 2 nights later. This time his eyes stayed open longer, unfocused but searching, and when he looked at Sarah, something flickered in his expression, something that wasn't confusion. She leaned forward, her voice soft. "Ethan, can you hear me?" His lips parted slightly, the effort visible, the sound faint but real. "Who are you?" Her heart ached at the question, but she didn't let it show. She smiled and said gently, "I'm Sarah, your wife." And though the words still felt surreal, she meant them, with every part of her. The following days unfolded with both hope and uncertainty. Ethan's body had awakened, but his mind was fractured. He remembered numbers, names of cities, fragments of business meetings and company mergers. But when it came to people, to emotion, to the threads of relationships that once wove his world together, everything had unraveled. He looked at Sarah not with recognition, but with quiet curiosity, like she was a stranger who spoke in soft tones and carried sadness in her eyes, yet never asked for anything in return. Sarah remained steady. She brought tea to his bedside, read to him when he couldn't sleep, listened when he asked simple questions about the estate, about the weather, about the nurses' names, but not about their past. He didn't ask how they had met or why she had become his wife, and she didn't push. She knew the answers would come only when he was ready to face them. Olivia, however, wasted no time. She reappeared at the estate like she had never left, gliding through the marble halls as if her absence had been a misunderstanding instead of abandonment. She entered Ethan's room every morning in silk and diamonds, her voice full of practiced warmth, telling stories of their supposed love, of romantic trips to Europe, private dinners on rooftops, whispered secrets in the dark. Ethan listened with polite silence, his expression unreadable, but Sarah noticed how his shoulders tensed every time Olivia touched his hand without asking. What disturbed Sarah more than Olivia's presence was how naturally she lied. Each memory she painted was so vivid, so detailed, that even Sarah, sitting quietly in the corner, felt like she was being pushed out of a story she had never been part of to begin with. But she knew the truth. Olivia had left when Ethan fell, had vanished to chase a film deal in New York, had refused to return until she heard he was waking up, and now she had come back, not out of love, but ambition, determined to reclaim what she believed was hers. Sarah felt torn between silence and justice, her days filled with the quiet ache of being invisible beside the man she had grown to care for, and the rage of watching someone rewrite a history that had never existed. Still she said nothing, trusting that the truth, if it mattered, would rise on its own. Until the night she found the file, she hadn't meant to find it. The drawer in Ethan's study was locked, but not secure. Her sketchbook had fallen beneath his desk, and when she reached to grab it, her fingers brushed against a tiny hairpin she often used to tie up her hair. Curiosity tugged at her. Something about the drawer had always felt oddly restricted, and before she knew it, she was kneeling beside it, the pin in the lock, the soft click breaking the silence like a confession. Inside was a folder marked simply with the date of Ethan's accident. Her breath caught as she flipped through the papers, medical reports, police statements, insurance documents. But one report stood out, a mechanical analysis of the car, the final line underlined in red. Brake lines were deliberately severed, and beside it, a single note clipped to the page, handwritten and chilling in its simplicity. Payment confirmed. Work completed as requested. Sarah's knees went weak, the room spun around her. She sat on the floor, rereading the note, the handwriting neat and unfamiliar. Yet the truth screamed louder than any signature. This had not been an accident. Someone had tried to kill Ethan, and had nearly succeeded. Her mind raced as she tried to process the implications. Only a handful of people had access to Ethan's personal vehicle. Fewer still knew his driving routines. And of them, only one had disappeared conveniently the week of the crash, and reappeared just as suddenly now. Olivia. Sarah took the documents and slipped out of the room, her heart pounding, the hallway dark and quiet as the household slept. In her room she laid the papers across her bed, eyes scanning them over and over, looking for a missing detail, a flaw in the theory. But there was none, only a dark certainty building in her chest. Olivia had tried to kill Ethan, whether for inheritance, insurance, or simply to escape a future she had never truly wanted. Sarah didn't know, but she couldn't stay silent anymore. The next day, she asked the driver to take her into town. She visited the mechanic shop listed in the report, a small place on the outskirts, run by a man whose face turned pale the moment she showed him the photo of Ethan's car and the date of service. He tried to brush her off at first, but when she mentioned the police and held up the payment receipt, he cracked. "She came in wearing sunglasses and red lipstick," he said, wiping his hands nervously. "Said it was a surprise for her fiancé. Wanted the car to break down dramatically near a restaurant. I didn't ask questions. I was paid to do a job." Sarah asked him to describe her. He did, and every detail pointed to Olivia. When she returned to the estate, she carried with her not just the weight of truth, but the evidence to prove it. She knew she couldn't act alone, not without risking being dismissed, ignored, maybe even silenced by the power Olivia still held in name and presence. So she waited, knowing her moment would come. That moment arrived sooner than expected. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in the garden, wrapped in a blanket, trying to regain strength in his legs. With the help of his therapist, Olivia arrived with champagne and laughter, insisting on sitting close, whispering in his ear. But this time, Ethan gently pulled his arm away, looking at her not with affection but discomfort. Sarah, standing nearby with a tray of tea, noticed the shift and held her breath. He turned toward her, his eyes lingering on her face a moment longer than usual. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice rough from weeks of disuse. "Why do I remember your voice when I sleep?" Olivia froze, the glass in her hand tightening. Sarah stepped closer but didn't speak, letting the silence answer for her. Ethan looked between them, confusion in his gaze. But something else, too. A question forming behind his eyes. And in that moment, Sarah realized he was starting to see through the fog, to remember the things Olivia had worked so hard to erase. That night, Sarah left the folder on Ethan's nightstand. She said nothing, simply placed it there and kissed his forehead gently, then whispered, "You deserve to know what really happened." She walked out of the room with her heart thudding in her chest, knowing the choice now belonged to him, and if he truly wanted the truth, it was finally within reach. The storm rolled in with a sharp wind and darkening skies. Thunder grumbled over the mountains as if nature itself could sense the tension building within the Blackwood estate. Inside, the air was heavy with something unspoken, a pause before impact. Ethan had read every page of the folder Sarah left for him, twice, then a third time, his hands trembling as he turned each sheet, his breath shallow as the truth settled into place. The brakes had not failed on their own. Someone had planned his accident, and that someone had been in his life, close enough to smile at him and call him by name. He sat in the dim light of his study, no longer just a man recovering from a coma, but a man waking up in every sense. The world he had trusted was gone. The faces he once thought loyal were blurred with deception, and the only clarity came from the quiet presence of a woman he didn't remember marrying, yet who had never left his side. Sarah had not tried to defend herself or win his affection. She had only stayed, patiently, consistently, like a lighthouse in the storm. He called for his assistant and gave simple instructions. Gather everyone in the grand hall by evening. No excuses, no delays. The assistant hesitated, sensing the gravity in Ethan's voice, then nodded and disappeared to carry out the order. As the sun disappeared behind thick clouds, and rain tapped against the glass like fingers at the edge of memory, the estate prepared for what none of them could predict. By 7 o'clock, the chandeliers glowed, the room filled with quiet voices and shifting eyes. Olivia stood near the fireplace, dressed in crimson silk, her smile elegant but tight. Margaret Blackwood stood beside her, unsure but unwilling to confront what she did not yet understand. Ethan entered last, walking without aid for the first time since his accident, his steps slow but sure, his presence undeniable. Silence fell as he moved to the center of the room, then turned to face them all. "I called you here because I've remembered something." His voice was calm, clear, stronger than it had been in weeks. "Not everything, but enough." He looked at Olivia, his eyes steady. "Enough to know that someone tried to kill me." A collective gasp stirred the room. Olivia's smile froze. Her fingers clutched the stem of her wineglass with sudden tension. Ethan continued, "And I know who it was." Sarah stood near the doorway, hands clasped in front of her. She didn't speak, didn't move. She had no need to. The truth was already moving like a current through the room. Olivia stepped forward, laughing lightly, her voice dripping with practiced disbelief. "Ethan, darling, I think you've misunderstood something. These weeks have been hard on you. Your mind isn't clear." But her words bounced off the coldness in his gaze. "I have evidence," he said simply, turning toward the staff gathered at the back. "You all should see it too." At his nod, his assistant stepped forward with a folder, copies of the documents Sarah had discovered, placed on a table for anyone to read. Ethan's voice cut through the rising whispers. "This isn't about confusion or memory. This is about betrayal." Olivia's face drained of color, her charm flickering like a dying flame. She looked toward Margaret for support but found none, only silence and a frown, deepening with every word Ethan spoke. "You hired someone to sabotage my car," he said. "You wanted out of the engagement, out of the contract, and into your own future without me." The room held its breath as Olivia opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time she had no script, no pretense, no way to spin what had been exposed. Ethan looked at her one last time and said with finality, "You are no longer welcome in this house." Margaret stepped forward then, her voice cold and sharp. "You've brought shame to this family, to your name, to yourself. Leave before I call security." Olivia stared at her mother, disbelief turning to rage, then to something hollow. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting Sarah's in one last flash of fury, before she walked out of the hall, her heels clicking like a drumbeat of retreat. As the door closed behind her, silence returned. Not heavy this time, but cleansing, a space left behind by the fall of something toxic. Ethan turned then, not to his staff or his family, but to Sarah. She stood quietly as always, watching him not with expectation, but with the quiet steadiness he'd come to know without knowing why. He walked toward her, every step deliberate, and when he reached her, he took her hands in his. I remember pieces, he said softly, but not all, not yet. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes uncertain but open. He continued, Still, there's something I feel when I look at you, something true, something I trust. He paused, drawing in a breath that trembled slightly at the edges. You were there when no one else was. You stayed when you didn't have to, and even now, when the truth has cleared the room, you haven't said a word to defend yourself, because you never needed to. Sarah blinked, her throat tightening, her hand still wrapped in his. I didn't want anything from you, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. I just wanted you to have someone in the room. Ethan nodded slowly, the flicker of a smile touching his lips, not wide, not dramatic, but real, the kind that comes from a place deeper than memory. And now I don't want the room without you. The guests slipped away one by one, the staff returned to their duties, and soon the hall was empty, except for them. The storm still rumbled outside, but inside the estate, something had shifted, something had broken and been rebuilt, and for the first time in weeks, peace felt possible. Later that night, Ethan sat in his room with Sarah beside him. No machines, no nurses, just the two of them. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small sketchbook she had left behind weeks earlier. He had seen her draw when she thought no one was watching. Now he flipped through the pages, each sketch capturing moments of stillness, of care, of love without condition. You drew me before I knew who you were, he murmured. I drew who I hoped you would become again, she answered gently, and he reached for her hand once more, holding it not as a gesture of thanks, but as something more, something that neither of them had words for yet, but both could feel rising like the first light after a long night. The days that followed unfolded quietly, but not without meaning. Ethan began walking again, with more strength. He met daily with therapists and doctors, answered questions about his past with growing clarity, but one truth remained unchanged. His memories of Sarah had not returned, not in the form of facts or images, but something else lingered, something deeper than logic, a sense of familiarity he could not explain. He often found himself looking for her before realizing he had done so, noticing how she moved through a room, how her voice softened in the evenings when she read aloud, how her hands trembled slightly when she was upset, but she always kept them steady when tending to him. Sarah remained calm on the surface, but every day became harder to navigate. The more time she spent near Ethan, the more she struggled to separate what they had from what they could have had. She never asked him to remember, never reminded him of the night she sat beside his bed holding his hand. She never mentioned how many times she had cried in silence when no one believed she belonged. She simply did what she had always done, stayed near, stayed quiet, stayed real. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains casting golden light across the room, Ethan looked up from the book he was holding and said, You don't talk much about the past. Sarah glanced at him, uncertain how to respond, then placed the teacup in her hand down and said softly, Because I don't think it's the past that matters now. What matters is who you become next and where you choose to go from here. Ethan watched her, his expression unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes, a weight lifting slightly, a thought taking root. The following week brought subtle changes. Ethan began seeking Sarah out more often. He asked her to join him for meals, to walk with him through the gardens, to sit with him by the fireplace where they would share long silences that felt strangely full. Sometimes he would touch her hand briefly, not by accident, but gently, deliberately, as if grounding himself through her presence. He smiled more, not the polite smile he gave to the nurses or his board members, but something warmer, something closer to joy, though he never spoke of what he felt, not yet. Sarah, though grateful, guarded her heart. She reminded herself daily that none of this was certain, that even kindness could be temporary, especially from a man whose entire life had been stitched together by power, control, and expectation. Yet no matter how she tried to protect herself, her heart betrayed her with every glance, every conversation, every quiet evening shared in his presence. It was on one such evening, after a long walk through the garden, when Ethan caught her wrist gently as she turned to leave, his voice low and uncertain. "Stay." She paused, unsure if she had heard him right. He continued, "I don't know why, but when you're here, the silence doesn't feel so heavy." She turned back, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "I'll stay as long as you want me to." And in that moment, something passed between them that no contract or wedding vow had ever given, a sense of choice, of mutual understanding, not of duty, but of something growing quietly beneath the surface. But not everyone was ready to let go of the past. Olivia had not disappeared entirely. Despite her public disgrace, she had resources, allies, and an unshakable ego. When whispers began circulating that Ethan had grown close to his quiet bride, Olivia returned once more, this time with rage sharpened into purpose. She arrived at the estate unannounced, pushing past the guards with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. She stormed into the drawing room where Sarah was helping Ethan adjust his cane, her voice cutting the air like glass. "This has gone on long enough." Ethan looked up, his expression calm, but wary. Sarah remained still, her fingers frozen around the wooden cane. Olivia crossed her arms and said, "She's manipulating you. You don't remember, but I do. She didn't want this marriage. She was forced into it. For money. For family. She never loved you." Sarah said nothing. She looked at Ethan and waited, her silence more powerful than any defense. Ethan stared at Olivia for a long moment before replying, his voice even. "Then why is she still here?" Olivia faltered, her mouth opening, then closing. He continued, "If she was only here for money, why hasn't she left now that I'm awake?" The room fell quiet. Olivia had no answer because deep down, she knew what Ethan now suspected. Sarah had stayed not for power or wealth, but because she cared. Ethan stood slowly, leaning slightly on his cane, and turned to Sarah. "Did you know she had tried to kill me?" Sarah met his eyes and nodded. "I suspected, and I found proof." His voice dropped, quiet but sharp. "And you didn't tell me," she answered. "I wanted you to see it on your own. I didn't want to be the one who decided who you should trust." Ethan looked at her as if seeing her for the first time again, not as a stranger, not even as a wife, but as someone who had chosen the harder path when the easier one had been within reach, and that recognition stirred something deeper inside him, a sense of admiration that blended quickly into something more tender. That night, long after the confrontation had passed and Olivia had once again disappeared into the night with nothing left to gain, Ethan found Sarah on the balcony overlooking the garden, her hair loose in the wind, her eyes distant. He stepped beside her and said quietly, "I remember the crash now." Sarah turned to him slowly. His eyes were dark, focused, heavy with the weight of truth. "It wasn't just a blur. I remember the feeling of the wheel locking, the sound of the brakes failing, the look on her face when I glanced in the rearview mirror." He paused, his voice steady. "I saw her standing at the corner, watching." Sarah didn't speak. She simply placed her hand over his and waited. He continued, "And then I remember you. Not your face. Not clearly, but your voice. Every night, when everything else was dark, your voice kept pulling me back." She felt her breath catch, her fingers tightening around his. Ethan turned to her. "I don't remember the wedding. I don't remember how this started, but I know what I feel now, and I know what I want moving forward." Sarah's eyes searched his, trying to believe, trying not to fall too quickly into a dream that might still be broken. He stepped closer and said gently, "I may not remember the moment I first loved you, but I know I love you now." And in that quiet, beneath the fading light and rising stars, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this love was real after all. The morning after Ethan's confession, the air around the Blackwood estate felt different, lighter somehow. The weight of deception had finally lifted, leaving behind something softer, something real. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting gold across the marble floors. And for the first time since her arrival, Sarah felt like she belonged not as a guest or a stranger, but as someone who had earned her place not through force or accident, but through choice and unwavering presence. Ethan stood at the balcony, watching the gardens bloom below. Sarah stepped beside him quietly. Their hands brushed, and then settled together with the ease of something natural. He turned to her and said, "You changed everything, without ever asking for anything." She looked at him, her voice gentle. "I never wanted anything except the truth, and maybe a little peace." He smiled and replied, "Then it's time we have both." That afternoon, he gathered the household, the family, and the remaining members of the board who had flown in for a meeting, but instead of financial reports or estate decisions, Ethan made a simple announcement. "Sarah Walker married me under impossible circumstances, but she chose to stay when she had every reason to walk away. She is not only my wife by law, but my partner by heart, and from today, she will be acknowledged as such." Margaret Blackwood approached Sarah afterward, her eyes softer than ever before. She reached for Sarah's hands and said quietly, "I misjudged you. I saw a quiet girl and assumed weakness. But what I see now is someone who loves without demand, and that kind of love is rare." Sarah smiled, with gratitude, not for the words, but for the quiet acceptance that followed them. Weeks later, under a sky dusted with stars, Ethan led Sarah into the same garden where they had walked in silence so many times. Only this time, there was music playing softly and candles flickering along the stone paths. He turned to her, pulled a small velvet box from his coat pocket, and dropped to one knee. Sarah froze, tears already rising as he said, "I know we're already married, but none of it was ours, not by choice, not by heart. So I'm asking you now, not for obligation or family or business, but for love. Will you marry me again? This time for real?" Her voice trembled as she whispered yes, and he slipped the ring onto her finger, not as a promise of wealth or security, but as a vow to choose her every day. The second ceremony was small, just close family, the few staff who had become friends, and no press, no performance, only love. When Sarah walked down the aisle in a simple lace gown, Ethan waited with eyes full of quiet wonder, and when he took her hands, he whispered, "You were the light when I was lost."